Chapter 23. That Ruth had little faith in his power as a writer did not alter her nor diminish her in Martin's eyes. In the breathing spell of the vacation he had taken, he had spent many hours in self-analysis, and thereby learned much of himself. He had discovered that he loved beauty more than fame, and that what desire he had for fame was largely for Ruth's sake. It was for this reason that his desire for fame was strong. He wanted to be great in the world's eyes, to make good, as he expressed it, in order that the woman he loved should be proud of him and deem him worthy. As for himself, he loved beauty passionately, and the joy of serving her was to him sufficient wage. And more than beauty, he loved Ruth. He considered love the finest thing in the world. It was love that worked the revolution in him, changing him from an uncouth sailor to a student and an artist. Therefore, to him, the finest and greatest of the three, greater than learning and artistry, was love. Already he had discovered that his brain went beyond Ruth's, just as it went beyond the brains of her brothers or the brain of her father. Above the things of the earth, above wealth and judgment, public opinion and applause, rising above life itself and dying on a kiss. Much of this Martin had already reasoned out, and some of it he reasoned out later. In the meantime he worked, taking no recreation except when he went to see Ruth, and living like a Spartan. He paid $2.50 a month rent for the small room he got from his Portuguese landlady, Maria Silva, a virago, a widow, hard-working and harsher-tempered, rearing her large brood of children somehow, and drowning her sorrow and fatigue at regular intervals in a gallon of the thin, sour wine that she bought from the corner grocery and saloon for 15 cents. From detesting her and her foul tongue at first, Martin grew to admire her as he observed the brave fight she made. There were but 4 rooms in the little house, 3 when Martin's was subtracted. One of these, the parlor, gay with an ingrain carpet, and dolorous with a funeral card and a death picture of one of her numerous departed babes, was kept strictly for company. The blinds were always down, and her barefooted tribe was never permitted to enter the sacred precinct save on state occasions. She cooked, and all ate, in the kitchen, where she likewise washed, starched, and ironed clothes on all days of the week except Sunday. For her income came largely from taking in washing from her more prosperous neighbors. Remained the bedroom, small as the one occupied by Martin, into which she and her 7 little ones crowded and slept. It was an everlasting miracle to Martin how it was accomplished, and from her side of the thin partition he heard nightly every detail of the going to bed, the squalls and squabbles, the soft chattering, and the sleepy, twittering noises as of birds. Another source of income to Maria were her cows, 2 of them, which she milked night and morning, and which gained a surreptitious livelihood from vacant lots and the grass that grew on either side the public sidewalks, attended always by one or more of her ragged boys, whose watchful guardianship consisted chiefly in keeping their eyes out for the poundman. In his own small room Martin lived, slept, studied, wrote, and kept house. Before the one window, looking out on the tiny front porch, was the kitchen table that served as desk, library, and typewriting stand. The bed, against the rear wall, occupied 2/3 of the total space of the room. The table was flanked on one side by a gaudy bureau, manufactured for profit and not for service, the thin veneer of which was shed day by day. This bureau stood in the corner, and in the opposite corner, on the table's other flank, was the kitchen. The oil stove on a dry goods box, inside of which were dishes and cooking utensils, a shelf on the wall for provisions, and a bucket of water on the floor. Martin had to carry his water from the kitchen sink, there being no tap in his room. On days when there was much steam to his cooking, the harvest of veneer from the bureau was unusually generous. Over the bed, hoisted by a tackle to the ceiling, was his bicycle. At first he had tried to keep it in the basement, but the tribe of Silva, loosening the bearings and puncturing the tires, had driven him out. Next he attempted the tiny front porch until a howling southeaster drenched the wheel a night long. Then he had retreated with it to his room and slung it aloft. A small closet contained his clothes and the books he had accumulated, and for which there was no room on the table or under the table. Hand in hand with reading, he had developed the habit of making notes, and so copiously did he make them that there would have been no existence for him in the confined quarters had he not rigged several clotheslines across the room on which the notes were hung. Even so, he was crowded until navigating the room was a difficult task. He could not open the door without first closing the closet door, and vice versa. It was impossible for him anywhere to traverse the room in a straight line. To go from the door to the head of the bed was a zigzag course that he was never quite able to accomplish in the dark without collisions. Having settled the difficulty of the conflicting doors, he had to steer sharply to the right to avoid the kitchen. Next, he sheered to the left to escape the foot of the bed, but this sheer, if too generous, brought him against the corner of the table. With a sudden twitch and lurch, he terminated the sheer and bore off to the right along a sort of canal, one bank of which was the bed and the other the table. When the one chair in the room was at its usual place before the table, the canal was unnavigable. When the chair was not in use, it reposed on top of the bed, though sometimes he sat on the chair when cooking, reading a book while the water boiled, and even becoming skillful enough to manage a paragraph or two while steak was frying. Also, so small was the little corner that constituted the kitchen, he was able, sitting down, to reach anything he needed. In fact, it was expedient to cook sitting down. Standing up, he was too often in his own way. In conjunction with a perfect stomach that could digest anything, he possessed knowledge of the various foods that were at the same time nutritious and cheap. Pea soup was a common article in his diet, as well as potatoes and beans, the latter large and brown and cooked in Mexican style. Rice, cooked as American housewives never cook it and can never learn to cook it, appeared on Martin's table at least once a day. Dried fruits were less expensive than fresh, and he had usually a pot of them, cooked and ready at hand, for they took the place of butter on his bread. Occasionally he graced his table with a piece of round steak, or with a soup bone. Coffee, without cream or milk, he had twice a day, in the evening substituting tea, but both coffee and tea were excellently cooked. There was need for him to be economical. His vacation had consumed nearly all he had earned in the laundry, and he was so far from his market that weeks must elapse before he could hope for the first returns from his hack work. Except at such times as he saw Ruth or dropped in to see his sister Gertrude, he lived a recluse, in each day accomplishing at least 3 days' labor of ordinary men. He slept a scant 5 hours, and only one with a constitution of iron could have held himself down, as Martin did, day after day, to 19 consecutive hours of toil. He never lost a moment. On the looking-glass were lists of definitions and pronunciations. When shaving or dressing or combing his hair, he conned these lists over. Similar lists were on the wall over the oil stove, and they were similarly conned when he was engaged in cooking or in washing the dishes. New lists continually displaced the old ones. Every strange or partly familiar word encountered in his reading was immediately jotted down, and later, when a sufficient number had been accumulated, were typed and pinned to the wall or looking-glass. He even carried them in his pockets and reviewed them at odd moments on the street, or while waiting in butcher shop or grocery to be served. He went farther in the matter. Reading the works of men who had arrived, he noted every result achieved by them, and worked out the tricks by which they had been achieved, the tricks of narrative, of exposition, of style, the points of view, the contrasts, the epigrams. Of all these he made lists for study. He did not ape. He sought principles. He drew up lists of effective and fetching mannerisms, till out of many such, culled from many writers, he was able to induce the general principle of mannerism, and, thus equipped, to cast about for new and original ones of his own, and to weigh and measure and appraise them properly. In similar manner, he collected lists of strong phrases, the phrases of living language, phrases that bit like acid and scorched like flame, or that glowed and were mellow and luscious in the midst of the arid desert of common speech. He sought always for the principle that lay behind and beneath. He wanted to know how the thing was done. After that, he could do it for himself. He was not content with the fair face of beauty. He dissected beauty in his crowded little bedroom laboratory, where cooking smells alternated with the outer bedlam of the Silva tribe. And, having dissected and learned the anatomy of beauty, he was nearer being able to create beauty itself. He was so made that he could work only with understanding. He could not work blindly, in the dark, ignorant of what he was producing, and trusting to chance and the star of his genius, that the effect produced should be right and fine. He had no patience with chance effects. He wanted to know why and how. His was deliberate creative genius, and, before he began a story or poem, the thing itself was already alive in his brain, with the end in sight and the means of realizing that end in his conscious possession. Otherwise, the effort was doomed to failure. On the other hand, he appreciated the chance effects in words and phrases that came lightly and easily into his brain, and that later stood all tests of beauty and power, and developed tremendous and incommunicable connotations. Before such he bowed down and marveled, knowing that they were beyond the deliberate creation of any man. And no matter how much he dissected beauty in search of the principles that underlie beauty and make beauty possible, he was aware always of the innermost mystery of beauty to which he did not penetrate and to which no man had ever penetrated. He knew full well from his Spencer that man can never attain ultimate knowledge of anything, and that the mystery of beauty was no less than that of life, nay, more that the fibers of beauty and life were intertwisted, and that he himself was but a bit of the same non-understandable fabric, twisted of sunshine and stardust and wonder. In fact, it was when filled with these thoughts that he wrote his essay entitled Stardust, in which he had his fling, not at the principles of criticism, but at the principal critics. It was brilliant, deep, philosophical, and deliciously touched with laughter. Also, it was promptly rejected by the magazines as often as it was submitted. But having cleared his mind of it, he went serenely on his way. It was a habit he developed of incubating and maturing his thought upon a subject, and of then rushing into the typewriter with it. That it did not see print was a matter of small moment with him. The writing of it was the culminating act of a long mental process, the drawing together of scattered threads of thought, and the final generalizing upon all the data with which his mind was burdened. To write such an article was the conscious effort by which he freed his mind and made it ready for fresh material and problems. It was in a way akin to that common habit of men and women troubled by real or fancied grievances, who periodically and volubly break their long-suffering silence and have their say till the last word is said. End of chapter 23.